Episode 30. A Delivery Truck Driver. Delivery truck drivers take the risk of driving for long, grueling hours on the road to head to their destinations while trying to stay awake. A misstep could prove to be costly in terms of their safety and the amount of goods that would be damaged. For Chris, he was used to driving for days across the country, and to save the travel allowances given to him by his employers, Chris would sleep in his truck at night instead of sleeping in a motel. However, one night's experience made him think twice every time he considered sleeping in his heavy vehicle again. He would always think back about the literally rocky night that he had to experience. It was pouring rain as Chris remembered himself driving along the empty highway. It was almost 12 midnight, and he still had over 300 miles to go before he arrived at his destination. And feeling that his eyes were almost closing and how dangerous it was to drive in the heavy rain, Chris exited the highway and took a narrow road in search for a suitable place to park his truck for the night. Chris drove slowly as he searched for an isolated road where not many vehicles would pass through. He drove slowly in the slippery weather, and eventually Chris saw a stretch of streetlights up about a quarter of a mile ahead. He slowly drove forward in the rain, and once he was near, Chris realized that there were parallel parking spots for both normal-sized and heavy vehicles. Chris then thought to himself, "Great, this spot is perfect to fall asleep in this cold weather. There are streetlights, no other vehicles around. I can finally get some good, undisturbed sleep." Chris then safely parked his truck first before looking at his surroundings. Once parked, and although under the streetlights, he couldn't see out in a distance to his sides as the rain was still pouring. All he could see to his right was an upslope forested area, while to his left was what seemed like a grass patch. But as the rain began to slowly subside, Chris could now see further into the distance. He looked to his left, and what he thought was a grass patch earlier was actually a rather small cemetery area. The cemetery looked like an old one, with weeds growing thick from within each individual grave, looking as though it hasn't been taken care of for a long time. This made Chris slightly uncomfortable, and after initially considering if he should find an alternative spot, he got rid of the thought almost immediately. Chris knew how difficult it would be for a heavy vehicle like his to find another convenient parking spot. And feeling exhausted in the cold weather, Chris just wanted to recline his seat, pull out his blanket, and go to sleep. So Chris did just that. He turned off his engine, wound down his window slightly, and fell asleep almost instantly after a long day of driving. Later into the night, however, Chris was woken up from the truck, slightly rocking back and forth. Initially, Chris thought that it was his own tossing and turning in his sleep that was causing it. But as he opened his eyes, Chris realized that it couldn't be him, as he lay there still, while his truck continued moving. Chris sat up and looked at both his side mirrors to see if there was anyone around. However, he couldn't see anyone there. Noticing that the rain had stopped, Chris decided to exit his truck and walk to the back to see if anyone had climbed in, even though the rocking had stopped. Chris took his baseball bat, which he placed near his passenger seat in case of an emergency, and stealthily stepped out of his vehicle. Chris tiptoed to the back and also checked the bottom of his truck in case there was anyone underneath. As he saw no one, Chris walked to the back and swiftly opened the truck's back door just to make sure that there wasn't anyone inside. To completely clear his doubts, Chris took a last look above his truck. As nothing was there as well, Chris concluded that the only possible explanation for the rocking was that there was something else disturbing him, especially since he was parked right beside a cemetery. But as he was still feeling exhausted from the long drive, Chris got back into his vehicle and went back to sleep. About 10 minutes later, Chris felt his truck rock back and forth again. This time, Chris tried to ignore the disturbances. To help create a less eerie atmosphere, Chris also turned on the vehicle's radio. However, it didn't work, as his truck was still rocking back and forth. Out of frustration and trying to get some sleep while still having his eyes shut, Chris just said out loud, "Can you please stop bothering me? I'm not disturbing anyone and all I want is to get some sleep." The truck then stopped shaking, and Chris was glad that he could finally rest at ease. But as he was falling into a deep sleep, Chris then heard humming sounds, which seemed to come from a lady. Chris opened his eyes, and again, nothing was there. Chris was now more annoyed than afraid, as he felt that he was being constantly teased by what he was now confident were the spirits of the cemetery. As he sat and thought about how he could get rid of the disturbances, that was when Chris saw an elderly man on the front left side of his view. The man walked in between the graves, seeming to head towards the road where Chris was parked. Chris wasn't really afraid, he was just curious about who the man was, as his instinct knew that it was indeed a person he was seeing. As the elderly man reached the pavement, he turned right and walked towards Chris's truck, and that was when Chris saw that the elderly man was limping, as he wore an old and stained pair of clothes and had a straw hat on his head. He was at least in his 70s and walked towards Chris with a smile on his face, like a close resemblance to a scarecrow. Chris knew that from the elderly man's body language that he wanted to chat. So, Chris wound down his window, initiated the interaction, and said, "Hello, sir." The elderly man raised one of his hands and waved as a gesture of response to Chris. He then said in a soft voice, "Hey there, young man. What brings you here?" "Oh, sir, I'm a delivery truck driver, and I'm here to get some rest as I've been driving the entire day. And I have a long way to go, so I was thinking of getting some shut-eye before I continue on the road," explained Chris. "Here's not a good place to rest, young man. I have been the night caretaker of this place for over 40 years now. Many drivers like yourself try to sleep here at night, but they will always get disturbed," said the elderly man. Feeling the need to understand why he was being disturbed, Chris then said, "Thanks, sir, for letting me know. Do you happen to know why they have been bothering me since I arrived just now? I mean, I'm just peacefully resting here and not disturbing anyone." "Because where you're parking your truck now is where some of the older graves used to be before roadworks were carried out here, and the remains of these graves were removed and put together elsewhere. So they don't really like seeing trucks over their graves. But if you would like, you can sleep between the graves with me. Of course, they will walk by you every now and then, but you can still get some sleep. You just need to ignore them," explained the elderly man. Thinking that there was absolutely no way he would sleep beside someone's grave, Chris then said, "Oh, wow, it's okay then, sir. I guess I will just drive to a nearby motel. I'm not exactly comfortable sleeping with spirits lingering around me," said Chris. The elderly man chuckled and said, "Okay then, there's a small motel a couple of miles ahead. You just need to take a left up front." "Okay, thanks a lot, sir. I shall do that," said Chris. Chris started his engine and drove off from the cemetery. As Chris looked at his side mirror and saw the elderly man waving goodbye to him. Chris wound down his window, stuck out his arm to wave goodbye as well. But when Chris re-looked at his side mirror again, he was slightly startled with what he saw. Not only did he saw the elderly man still waving, he also saw a couple of spirits within the grave area behind the man. The spirits were looking at Chris and smiled as though seemingly glad that Chris had finally left their home. Slightly worried that the spirits would follow him, Chris drove slowly while constantly looking at his rearview mirror, as he still couldn't believe what he was seeing. Thankfully, none of them did ever follow him. And although Chris had to spend his trip allowance on a motel that night, he knew that he had no other choice. For a good night's sleep so that he can safely drive again the next day, Chris knew that it was well worth the money. From then on, Chris knew that not everyone would welcome him to their home. Some prefer others to stay away from their personal space, especially for spirits who have trucks parked right on top of their sanctuary. They will make it a rocky night for their unwelcomed guests.